love getting a chance to sing about the greatness and the bigness of God. And I love getting to step back and realize that I am not big, I am not great, I do not have a universe. You do, and that's great. I don't know about you, but cats are very interesting to me. Are there any dog lovers in the house? Okay, a lot of dog lovers. Do we have cat lovers in the house? Yes, definitely fewer. It's very interesting because I think a lot of times we fall into cat syndrome. My parents have this cat that showed up on Christmas Eve and rang the doorbell. It's a long story. I don't know what the deal is. I didn't know they rang doorbells. But, you feed a dog, take care of a dog and play with it a little bit, throw the ball or something. And man, they think you are like the coolest thing since crystal clear Pepsi, right? I mean, you are cool, okay? You're like, oh, you are my master. You are awesome. But you feed a cat, it's like, someone bring the grapes, please. Sometimes I feel we get we tend to make God small and us big. And I love the setting in this field today that we can look back and go, indescribable. You are big. You are great. We're continuing in a series where we've been looking at the music of James Taylor and to find the truths in that music and to apply it to life with God. And I think that what we resonate with artists sometimes that talk about real stuff. And James Taylor is just real, and I like it. I'm trying to get some of the students to be converted to James Taylor, and it's still not happening. I've been trying for 3 weeks now, and they're just not into it. It's just not loud enough, not screaming enough, and not enough hip-hop. But eventually, maybe, we could do maybe a James Taylor hip-hop mix album. That'll do it, right? It's like Copperline meets Dr. Dre, and I don't know. In 1970, this album was released called Sweet Baby James. Anyone have a copy of Sweet Baby James? Yes. All right. Yeah, I'm so glad that my dear best friend in the whole wide world, Micah, listens to James Taylor because he listens to one album for a year at a time. And so it's the same album, and he knows every phrase, every stop, everything they could have done different, and he'll just quote it to you by memory. So I'm glad my man is getting diversified in his music. It's great. This album is extremely powerful, and it's so moving with this song, Fire and Rain. And with Fire and Rain, it's this real depiction of how life was for him at this certain point in time. And it's really written in 3 parts. The first part talks about this friend of James, Suzanne, and how she died, and he lost this dear friend at a time in his life when he was away. He was trying to start his career with Apple Records, and he'd lost his friend. His friends tried to keep him from knowing this so it wouldn't stop his progress, but eventually he found out and was the heart behind this song. And as we get down to the chorus about fire and rain and seeing all these different seasons of my life, we see into this dark side of James Taylor, the struggle, the suffering, the pain that he was experiencing, both from this loss and from some of the situations around. Some say depression or his battle with drugs, and that he's talking about fire and rain in life as lonely, life as not sunny, very cloudy, full of suffering. And then towards the end, he talks about his new journey into becoming this music icon that we celebrate that he hardly even knew of at the time. His departure from the Flying Machines band that he was in, and now he's in a new journey in a new spot. And there's something about this song that really connects with us. Can we get that out? Because it's really distracting me if you could. I really appreciate it. Thanks. The ADD's going, wow, that sounds like a foreign object. You're like, hey, we landed on the moon. So we connect with this at such a deep level because there's periods in our life where if we were to use a metaphor to describe it, we would say, yeah, those were the fire and rain days. Those were the days that I thought would never end. Those were the lonely times. Those were the times of loss, of pain, and of suffering. So today what I would like to do is to look at the book of Job and look at a man who suffered immensely and go through the whole story and find out what is our response to this? What do we do with this? George Barna did a poll and asked people, if you could ask God one question, what would it be? And an overwhelming majority of people said, Why is there pain and suffering in the world? For 1,500 years, since the beginning of time, since evil existed and pain and suffering existed, people have picked apart and asked why. Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? Why is there pain? For the Christian, they've been studying this theory called theodicy. That it says this: if God is all-powerful and all-loving, and evil exists in the world, then A, either God is not all-powerful, or B, God is not all-loving. And having this tension in how do we reconcile an all-powerful, a good God with evil and pain and chaos and unexplainable deaths and sickness and war and famine? How do we keep these in tension? The book of Job is a very daunting book. It's a very challenging book, but it's a very rich book, and it's filled with emotions. It's filled with all types of scenarios and situations that really make us connect to it in certain spots. And we can play with the characters and see that we were in this character one time, and we might be in this spot one time, and now we're here. And it's full of ups and downs, of good days, bad days, of questioning, of doubting, of uncertainty, of challenging, of faith. It's a span of many types of feelings and truths. And if we were to take one section out of Job and say this is all we can learn, we would do it a disservice, because it's just big story that's happening. And so my hope is that we'll be able to see this story and find ourselves in the story. And at the end be able to say, what is our response to pain and to suffering? In the prologue of Job chapter 1, we see that this play takes place. This story is happening. We learn about this man named Job, who's from the land of Uz. Uz was east of Israel, and Uz was soon to be a place full of pain and destruction and chaos. But this man was from this faraway land, and he was devout and righteous. He feared God. He kept commandments. He would go and he would sacrifice for his family, just in case if there were any sins that they didn't cover. He would sacrifice for them. He had 7 boys, 3 girls, 1 wife, a lot of cows, a lot of camel, lots of everything. That says of Job that he was the greatest man in the East, that he was the guy everyone wanted to be like, that he was who we hold up as this is the model person of society. In order to really understand Job, it helps to do this. There's 2 stages that this play is acting out on. We see the heavenly stage, as we're about to get into, and then there's the earthly stage. And unbeknownst to Job and the people involved in the story, they don't understand that it takes place on 2 separate stages. And so as we move from the prologue into the first chapter, chapter 1, verse 6, we see that there's this scene that's taking place in the heavenlies, where the angels and Satan, or the accuser, come to the heavenlies. And God says, where have you been, Satan? He says, roaming around the earth. I like to add, probably up to no good. And God then says, well, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the east, that he's the greatest of all men. He's upright. He fears me. He keeps my commands. And Satan says, well, if you were to take it all away from him, if he no longer had all this stuff, would you still be saying that about him? Putting God to the test, putting him on trial, saying this is the greatest man. And what I'm saying is that if you were to take this away, if this were to no longer be here, that he would no longer bless you. And so we go back to the earthly stage where this happens. Chapter 1, verse 13, and this is where we find ourselves for our scripture for today. It's up here on the screen, and we read that things change very quickly in the land of Uz. That one day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house." And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So here on the earthly stage, things have drastically changed for Job. Bad news after bad news after bad news after bad news. Any of you ever had one of those days? It's like it can't get any worse, and then it gets worse. And like there's no way, and then it gets worse. What was the book we read as children? The certain character with the horrible, no good, very bad day. Yeah, that's where we're at. And here, this great man of the East has now experienced extreme, horrid amounts of pain and loss. He once was the richest man of the East, and now all of his possessions are burned up. Once rich with his family, full of people to continue his name and his legacy, gone. And he responds in typical grieving fashion by shaving his head and taking off his outer garment. And then we see a little flip. Here in the text it says that Job worshiped. And that in all of this, in his response, he did not sin against God. And it'd be lovely if the story just stopped there. Job chapter 1, that's all we got. If that were not enough, in chapter 2, we see that there's this other dialogue again on this heavenly stage. The accuser is putting God on the test again, saying, okay, I know, but if you bring calamity on his life personally, if you struck him with illness, that he will not be devoted to you, that he will not have faith, he will not trust you, he will not be this upright, good standing follower of you. So we see that Job is stricken with illness, some say leprosy, just this pain and this illness that is almost debilitating to him. As if it couldn't get any worse, and even just brought his wife to say, curse God and die. And then later on we see that Job did not sin against God in his response. So here we have Job, shaved head, mourning, grieving, struggling with some type of sores all over his body, probably leprosy, and sitting by himself, sitting down, and his friends show up. 3 friends come to the scene we see around chapter 2, and they hardly even recognize Job. They hardly even know what's happening. Many of you, when you go through stuff, you just are hardly recognizable, right? It's one of those days you go, there's no makeup. I mean, I don't, you know, whatever you put on, you know, my blush is running, or what is it? Mascara, eyeshadow, I don't know. Maybelline, cool. Unrecognizable, and they go, all right, we come up on the scene, we've got a problem. And so guess what they do? They mourn with him and sit with him for 7 days of silence. 7 days. I can't be quiet for 2 minutes. If we were to stop and say, okay, everyone be quiet for 10 minutes, we'd feel awkward and weird and like creepy. And they sit with him for 7 days, trying to identify with the pain, trying to be present, trying to be people that come alongside him and go, your world just got shaken in a mighty way. We're going to sit with you. Finally, Job stands up to make his plea before God. He stands up and he's trying to ask the question, why? The question of the why of suffering has been debated and picked apart and talked about for 1,000 years. We could fill this room with books that ask the question why, from some of the best, brightest minds in the history of the planet that have tackled this issue. We could fill this room with books that just talk about Job chapter 1. And so we see that Job stands up and has this dialogue with God, and it's real and it's honest, and it's, is there any wicked way in me? Am I not upright? Have I done something to cause this suffering? Because the prevalent view in this time in Mesopotamia was that if you live a good life, you will not suffer. That if you're upright and righteous and keep commandments and are a good person, then suffering will not come to you. But what's happening here is that this view taken to the extreme, the best, the ideal person has lived this life, and now extreme suffering is upon him. And it threw everyone for the loop. After Job speaks, his friends decide to talk. And if you read along in the text, you'll see that it would have been better if they just kept their mouths shut. Right? You kind of read through this and go, man, with friends like these, who needs enemies? And I wish they would have stopped there and just been there. But there's something we can learn from it, is that in the suffering that's around us, the people that you know, the people that are going through their seasons of life, maybe you just need to sit down and shut up and be there for them. And just be right there for them. Not to offer them 7 steps to how to get your family back and to get over your grief and your loss, but just be there. And so these friends, it's this big dialogue. It's like it'd be 3 weeks of talk show that was going on. I mean, one friend would stand up and speak and talk about fairness and that you live the right life, so you better check yourself and make sure that everything is upright, because this is why this is happening. Then Job would come and give defense. He would plead his case. And then another friend would say, well, maybe your children sinned. Maybe someone in your family is doing this or that. And Job would plead his case. And then one would stand up and say, you shouldn't question God. You shouldn't even go down this road. And then Job would stand and plead his case. Long, it's like 20 chapters worth of it. And we see that he was taken a long way away from the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so what's interesting here is that we have no glimpse into the heavenly stage on this. God is silent for about 37 chapters. And finally, when Job is at his wit's end, God decides to speak. In your Bibles, in chapter 38, many of it says, God speaks. And you're like, whoa. And it's the most amazing dialogue, one of the most poignant, powerful phrases in all of Scripture where God speaks. Because up until this time, it's as if we've been putting God on trial, and Job had been putting God on trial. Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? Why am I going through this? Why can't you fix it? Why can't the universe be better? What's going on? And God speaks and says, why do you come at me with all this chatter devoid of wisdom? And then, very godlike, he says, Job, I'm about to speak to you, and you need to embrace it like a man. Whoa. He says, let me defend myself. Where were you when I created this universe? When I named the stars and put them into place, where were you? Where were you when I was measuring out the distance of this world? Were you making a universe when I was making one? And he goes through for the next couple of chapters and basically says, this is me. This is my resume. This is who I am. If you're going to put me on trial, then here is my defense. Everything from intricacies of creation to big creation stuff, to God saying, I am on the throne of this world. And they have this powerful dialogue. I mean, could you imagine being a fly on the wall for that? Oh, that had just been, whoa. And that's what Job does. Whoa is me, repentant, very sorry that he approached God this way. He's starting to think, oh my word, I just tried to tell God how to do his job, something we still don't struggle with. And so Job realizes that the why question of suffering was never answered. That God had plenty of time to answer the why, but it wasn't answered. Many people that are exploring God and thinking about God and thinking about devoting their life to God, this is a big hang-up for them. Because God, there's suffering in the world. Why? Many of us, we've probably asked the why question thousands of times. Why did this happen? Why did it go down like this? Why are they suffering so much? And I think we could ask a different question. We could ask, what now? What now? Look at the resilient faith that Job had in chapter 1 where he said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be your name. I can't pretend to know everything that we are all struggling with, everything that we've struggled with in the past, and I won't even try to see into the future and see what's coming down our way. But if you look back to the times when you have felt like you're stuck in this land of us, or trouble, calamity, pain have come, sometimes the answer to why is just not answered this side of heaven. And I wish I could tell you why, and I wish I could give you a real nice, neat answer about it, but I can't. And to be honest with you, I don't think God does. Because we view this a little different. We read through Job, and we almost put God up on trial and say, okay, evil suffering, defend yourself. Why did this happen to Job? Is this going to happen to me? If it happens to me, am I like Job? Am I now Job-like in my suffering? Why did this happen? Why does all this take place? But it's not answered. The book of Job is not about God being on trial for human suffering. The book of Job is centered around the theme of a man who had devout, unshakable, unrelenting faith in God. Faith that allowed him to ask questions, faith that allowed him to get real, to get honest, but at the end of the day, faith that said, give it, take it away, regardless. Blessed be your name. One writer said that faith like Job is unshakable because he was first shaken. You say, well, does how I respond to the trials and circumstances and suffering in my life even matter? Can one person's response change anything? Oh, you bet you it can. For thousands of years now, we have been looking at this character of Job, and somehow when it all falls apart, many of you, this is the first place you go. When it seems unbearable, you look back to the way he handled this. It's provided to be something that we cling and hold on to in our life with God. And so if you're in us today, if you are just getting out, or it might be knocking at your door, the suffering that's going to come might not be explainable. In fact, it probably won't. And I wish that we could go through, and the part in our brain that thinks that life with God all of a sudden rids us from all suffering and all pain and all problems. I wish we could take that out of us, because I don't know where we bought that. Because look, the models of our faith live lives full of suffering. You have Job, who was the greatest man of the East, suffering. You had Paul, who helped form and fashion the early church, who pleaded for God for 3 times to remove the thorn in his flesh. And it wasn't removed. We look to the character and the person of Jesus, who in the garden was sweating drops of blood to hopefully see if this cup could pass. And it didn't. Should we expect anything less? In this world, we will face trouble and suffering. But the good news of the gospel is that Christ has overcome the world. Christianity is not this pill you take to avoid problems. The good news of the gospel is that in your journey through struggle in life and us, there's someone with you to go through the suffering with. Some people say that the cross was God's way of saying to us, I understand. Rejection, I understand. Pain, I understand. Death, I understand. Losing loved ones, I understand. It's as if life is lived in between Psalm 22 and Psalm 23. Psalm 23, we have that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. There's green pastures, you're there, goodness and mercy, they follow me. And then Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's like we live in this tension. On the cross, it was a Psalm 22 day where Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so what I would say is this. If you are in a spot today filled with unexplainable grief, unexplainable incidents, unexplainable things that are happening to your life where you are stuck right in the middle of us, you're in good company. I can't explain the why, and I can't belittle your pain or your grief, but in some way, God is present in the suffering. It led Job to a place towards the end of the book where after everything was restored, everything was given back, he said this. He said, my ears have heard about you, but my eyes have seen you. Wow. And let's not forget, Job's story did not get resolved. Though things were given back to him, though he received twofold of all his possessions, he still lost his firstborn. His youngest girl was still lost. His middle children, gone. And if you look back at some of your suffering, sometimes this side of heaven, it doesn't resolve. It just doesn't. It doesn't resolve. And so my hope for today is that you would leave here with more questions about suffering instead of a plastic answer. And that through your questions about suffering, you would go right into it. And that what if out of your suffering, you were able to get to a spot where you say, God gives, God takes away. Blessed be your name. I can't explain, I can't understand, I cannot answer the question why, but somehow through this, my ears had heard about God and God's unconditional acceptance and compassion and grace and power, but now my eyes have seen it. And that after going through this journey, that maybe you would be able to identify suffering in others and come alongside and sit with them and be with them through it. Could you imagine if one of Job's buddies had the similar situation happen towards the end of his life? How do you think his response would have been? Do you think if Job saw suffering in his neighbors and in neighboring communities and friends, do you think he would sit and idly let that pass by? I don't think so. Imagine if this could be a place where the suffering can come and receive healing and ministry and reconciliation. And imagine if this would be a place where we come and pass out healing, reconciliation, and ministry to others in the world around us. My ears had heard about you, but my eyes have now seen. You know, I like to speculate in stories and sometimes imagine and play around with the text a little bit. And I wonder what it would look like at the end of Job's life. Like what happened? It says that he lived a long, fruitful life. But I wonder what changed. I wonder how you see people that have been through stuff and they have a story to tell. It's like they've lived through life, kind of like Curly from City Slickers. One thing. He had that to say. I wonder what it would look like if he was interviewed. Someone said, Joe, what have you learned in this experience? A musician was interviewed by David Letterman once he found out that he had cancer. And this was a couple weeks into it. And Letterman said, well, what can you tell me about life now? Now that you learned about this sickness, this disease, what can you tell me? And he said this. He said, Dave, I've learned to enjoy every sandwich. That this pain has a way of making us honest and making us appreciate life and appreciate the little things, such as sandwiches. And so I was thinking towards the end of Job's life, I had this picture of him going and sitting on a hill. And we all have songs that really resonate with us and songs that are always stuck in our head. But I picture the whole story from the cosmic stage to the earthly stage to the losing of family to the disease to the ups and the downs, losing everything, being great and then being weak. And I think he would have sung our song for the day. The chorus in his heart would have probably been something like Fire and Rain that chronicles his story. And that if he were to sum up his life, it would be this song.